Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoy video. Ryan here, welcome you to the beginning of the new coverage that we've got for GHB 23-24, which is basically covering, if you're not aware, the whole last year of AOS 3rd edition, where we'll be focusing on Andorian loci and other magic and non-magic related things in the frosted tundras of Andtor, or whatever, if you want to follow the lore. Today, instead of covering everything, we're going to actually be splitting everything up into different videos, and the easiest one I thought to go ahead and do right off the bat was just covering the endless spells. If you remember from this time last year, when we moved to Gallet, I guess, for the first of the two 6-month seasons, we had a good number of endless spell changes, and I ended up making a solo video just like this one where I covered all of the endless spells. Not only had the points changed, but the rules changed quite significantly with many, not only the abilities, but also the casting values and the setup ranges and so forth. This time, I feel like we've got a number of meaningful changes and a number of kind of neutral changes, which is somewhere in between what had happened between the first year of 3rd edition to going into the second, which is the last time I made this video, and then the very slight changes we had between the two 6-month seasons in the second year, where it was basically just a few points changes, and then Purple Sun changed a little bit. So it wasn't really worth making a video about back then. But now it is. So anyway, without further ado, just a reminder to join us in the Discord in the comments section below, and share, like, and subscribe the video to help boost the channel. As I've mentioned in a place or two here and there, we are about to hit 2,000 subscribers in the foreseeable future, so just want to kind of make you guys aware of that, see if we can push it over the edge sooner than later. Alright, so let's get down to it. Here we see a summary of what we're going to be talking about, which of course begins with an overview of endless spells in general in this GHB. Not how endless spells work per se, that could be in another video as a kind of AOS 101 course, but we're going to just be talking about the actual endless spells in general here, and then Warscrolls, all 17 of them in alphabetical order, then popular picks, and then I added a new section this year of Nerfed to Hell ? For a few endless spells that I think, maybe rightfully so, got put in their place. So let's go ahead and get on to the overview stuff. Alright, so I'm going to split this into average stats, then points, and then types of endless spells. Taking a look at our average stats, this is just a few kind of metrics here for you guys to see. The average points cost now is 52.35 points per endless spell, which means it actually went down a slight bit, about 4%. Not really that big of a change. Only 5 endless spells had their points changed anyway, and it wasn't by a ton, as you can see. The average casting value is now at around 6.0, which is interesting. A lot of times averages don't turn out to be perfectly round, but it worked out that way this time, which represents about a 3% increase in casting value. Not a big deal. That said, it's good to keep in mind that the casting value on an endless spell, keeping in mind that they want to be on the board as long as possible, usually you don't want your endless spells getting dispelled. And so sometimes it's actually wise to try to take ones with high casting values, especially if you're able to get them out, pump them out yourself. Now, obviously, in this new Andtorian, Wizards season, we're going to be adding a lot of primal dice to these things, so maybe my point holds a little less water here, but it is what it is. Sometimes having a good high casting value, if they've got to use one of those dice to get rid of something, okay, fine, they got rid of it, but they're not unbinding something else that you've got unless they happen to store up a ton of primal dice. So, considering these rules for the GHB will be lasting for the whole year, and so will probably these endless spell rules. Those things are kind of hand in hand here. And then setup range, the average setup range now is 10.12 inches, and that's wholly within, by the way. which represents a 2% increase from what we had before, if you find these metrics interesting. But let's move on to the points. All right, so I've listed them in descending value. We've got 3 that are at 80 points now, nothing at 90 points. We used to have Purple Sun at 90 points for a bit there, but now we got 3 at 80 points. That would be Bridge, Sun, and Spellportal. 1 at 70 points, that's Ravenak's Gnashing Jaws. We've got 3 at 60 points, which would be Lifeswarm, Swords, and Horrorghast. 3 at 50 points, Cogs, Geminids, and Lauchon. 4 at 40 points, which would be the modal outcome here. The most units that have a single value would be 40. That'd be Pendulum, Palisade, Shards, and Shackles. And then at 30, we've got Gravetide, Burning Head, and Maelstrom. Nothing is at 20. There was a point in time when Burning Head was at 20. So our range has been tightened up a little. But as you can see, everything's pretty consistent. And I think these are all decent prices. Moving on to the types. I've traditionally been splitting these into 4 categories. There's a little overlap, but there's a little less overlap than there once was. So direct damage spells are going to be your Pendulums, Burning Heads, Maelstrom, Purple Sun, Swords, Jaws, Gravetide. Technically, one of these guys also does damage. That would be Shackles can do it. I didn't list it under direct damage because it doesn't always go off, and it really is mainly just a debuff spell now. Debuffs would be, like I said, Shackles, but also Geminids, Horrorghast, Palisade, Purple Sun, and Shards. Buff would be Cogs, Lifeswarm, and Spellportal, and movement is also Cogs in the other. I guess you could think of movement as a buff, but Cogs in the other form of increasing or decreasing time is also a movement spell, and then Lauchon and Soulscream Bridge. Interesting to point out here is that none of these from the previous time I did this video had to really change categories. So I didn't do any edits on this one. So even though things might have gotten nerfed or buffed, they basically kept their same rules. All right, so let's move on to what we're going to be talking about with the Warscrolls themselves. Every one of the 17 Warscroll has a Warscroll ability, of course, and then I like to list the average effects that it does, average damage in general, and then the changes to the Warscroll since the last time we had it, and then my verdict of whether I thought it got buffed or nerfed, or stayed neutral. All right, so we're going to start with Aethervoid Pendulum going in alphabetical order. We got a points cost of 40, casting value 6, range of 8, and this is always wholly within. MC stands for movement characteristic, so 8 inches. And then now it can move in a straight line not only forward, but also backwards. That's new, that it can go backwards. And its effect range, this is something new I've added to each of these slides, is how, when it does what it wants to do, what the range of that ability is. So reading the ability, after this endless spell is moved, roll a dice for each unit that has any models that it passed across, and each other unit that's within 1 inch of it at the end of its move. On a 2+, that unit suffers D6 mortal wounds now. So the average damage went up because it used to be D3, so you'll see that it went from 1.67 mortal wounds to 2.92. You might say, well, why isn't it 2 to 3.5, which would be the expected value of a D3 to a D6? Well, it only goes off on a 2+. So that's 5/6 times those values. So obviously that's an improvement. Its points did go up from 30 to 40, so it's a 33.33% increase, and its casting value went up from 5 to 6. And like I said, it can now move backwards. This clearly got a buff, unless you think the points are unreasonable or the casting value is unreasonable. But here's the thing, is it's not that hard to get rid of this thing on the table. Yes, it gets to move every turn, but it has to move in a straight line. And your opponent can just, it can do more mortal wounds, but your opponent can very easily turn this thing off. The smartest players are probably going to be people trying to run it straight through, like, say, a center objective where someone's castling up. That's good, right? And then, of course, you can go back and forth. So, like, on one turn, you can run through the objective and then go back through it again. it's just, what it's really doing is creating incentive for them to move. It's not creating, it's not necessarily going to give you the damage that it looks like. So, yeah, if you want to see it as like a game of chicken, then I think it's gotten stronger for sure, but I don't know if it's really going to do what everyone's imagining it's doing. It's good that it does trigger over everything it runs over and everything within 1 inch, so that's good. All right, moving on. Burning Head, otherwise known as the Burning Head, but I've put it here in the B's. It's still 30 points, casting value 6+, range is 8, movement characteristic is 8 inches, and keep in mind that's the standard movement characteristic for predatory endless spells, and it has an effect range of 1. So after this endless spell is moved, the player picks 1 unit within 1 inch, so instead of everything, it's 1 unit. Now this got changed quite a bit. On a 2+, the Burning Head becomes part of the unit until destroyed or dispelled. At the end of each movement phase, and when I say destroyed, I mean the unit that it's a part of. At the end of each movement phase, on a 2+, that unit suffers D3 mortal wounds. Now, so this has changed a lot. What it used to do is like kind of go out and then explode, and once it did some mortal wounds to every unit within 3 inches, as you see, the effect range has gone down from 3 inches to 1 inch. It used to do on a 2+ D3 mortal wounds, which was 1.67 mortal wounds on average. The thing now is it becomes part of the unit, and which is weird. And they said they used wording that says it becomes a marker, and the new FAQ said that now you measure range to dispel it to and from the unit, and the actual model isn't on the table anymore. It's just a marker. It doesn't hold any space. It's like the guys absorbed the Burning Head and it keeps burning them from within. So it means that, especially for very large units, the range to this spell is pretty large, and it stops being predatory at that point. It's just in the unit, which is kind of cool. And so it kind of haunts this unit instead of a one and done. If you were trying to hit multiple units, it got nerfed. But if you like this idea that it's kind of living inside the unit and every movement phase, until they get rid of this thing, it's just slowly eating them away. This is a really great way to kill like a small hero, especially if you can't shoot them with the new way Lookout Sir works instead of the old last season's Galetian Champions no shooting rule. And so, all right, we've got that ticking up the damage. Now, like I said, it's not going to be doing it against 3 units. So I think it's a little bit of a trade-off, but I think in general this is a positive buff and that people are going to like toying around with this one, especially for its cheap points cost. Unfortunately, of course, at a casting value 6, you can get rid of it pretty easily, but then you get to cast it again and put it on a different unit. So, and you know for a fact it's going to at least go off once before they get a chance to try to dispel it. All right, moving on. Cogs. Oh, boy. Oh, Cogs, how you have fallen. Now, the points cost did go down from 70 to 50, which, as I wrote below, is over a 25% decrease. So, savings. Casting value is still 6. Range is still holier than 6. The effect range is holier than 12 inches if you're increasing, or holier than 6 inches if you're decreasing. Which has been reduced. Okay, so when you set up the spell, you must decide if it's increasing or decreasing the flow of time. And by the way, wizards within 6 inches of it, this is the last line here, at the start of the hero phase can change the flow of time later. But generally speaking, people set it, and then it stays. If it's increasing, it still does exactly what it did before, which is giving all units wholly within 12 inches of the spell reroll charge rolls. Which is good if you can get it set up. And the problem is it doesn't set up very far ahead. And a lot of times with charging, the problem is you're kind of trying to like yeet a unit out into the enemy's front lines or whatever. And likely the wizard who did this, remember you have to cast it in your own hero phase. So there's a good chance it's not necessarily going to be in range to do what you want it to do, but it could. And then decreasing is the bonus it's got now is it's giving wizards that are wholly within 6 inches of it a -1 to hit with missile attacks. And then it gives them ability to cast an Arcane Bolt or Mystic Shield without counting as one of their casting attempts. It doesn't let you cast multiple Arcane Bolts or Mystic Shields, just you get to basically do one of these that are kind of always there as options for free. Arcane Bolt's kind of a throwaway unless you just need to snipe a unit and you're not worried about getting in combat if you need to do D3. And then Mystic Shield, of course, is fantastic. Now, I said that it needs an FAQ because I think definitely the conservative reading is you get to cast with one wizard, either Arcane Bolt or Mystic Shield, once per turn. But the wording is a little ambiguous, and it could be interpreted that up to 2 wizards in your army can each cast one spell and then the other one. All right, so it could be interpreted as each wizard that's wholly within 6 inches of this gets to cast one of these spells if it hasn't been cast already. I think most TOs are going to rule it as only one spell gets to get cast, but I suppose it has more value if you get to do both. That'd be cool. But I still think this thing got nerfed to hell. Because what it used to do, as you see down below, was reroll casting rolls for all wizards wholly within 12 inches, which, of course, was fantastic for the likes of Tzeentch or the Warsong Bomb or Lumineth that wasn't running Techless. And this is just, it did lose 20 points, but come on. Like, the charge thing wasn't that solid. This is one of the hardest nerfs that we saw. So put those cogs on the shelf. They're just not doing what they used to do. And, some people from even before the last version know that it used to let you cast an extra spell. I think one wizard got to do it, or maybe all of them, but at least one. And that was also better than what this is. So, oh well. Its time in the sun has come and gone. It's no longer an auto take, but we'll cover that in the Nerf to Hell section. All right, Emerald Lifeswarm. This is doing exactly what it used to do. Points cost is 60, casting value is 6, setup wholly within 6, moves 8, and its effect is 3 inches. After it's moved, commanding player picks 1 unit within 3 inches. They can either heal up to D3 units, or if no wounds are allocated to it, return that many of wounds worth of slain models. No changes. It's neutral. It is what it is. It does what it says on the tin. It's a great spell if you need some healing in your army. All right. Geminids of Uhl-Gysh. Now, this one has definitely changed a bit. It's still 50 points. Its casting value is still 6 plus. Range is 8 inches. Movement characteristic is 8 inch. And it has 6 inch coherency. I've added this to my slides here because any of the endless spells that have 2 or more models often have a kind of restriction on how close they have to be placed to one another. So this is basically the 2 models after they move and on setup have to always be within 6 inches, not wholly within, just 6 inches. Their effect range is 1 inch. So after the endless spell is moved, roll dice for each unit that has any models that it passed across and each unit that is within 1 inch of it at the end of its move. And that's for both models, so it can hit quite a bit of things. On a 2+, that unit cannot issue or receive commands until the start of the next hero phase. All right. So what it lost was that it can no longer do one mortal wound. Who cares? But now turns off command abilities until next hero phase instead of just the next combat phase, which is always kind of a weird rule because endless spells move at the end of the hero phase. So that meant it was turning off command abilities in the movement phase, shooting phase, and charge phase, which was a good bit of them, all-out defense, all-out attack in the shooting phase, redeploy, 6 inch auto run in the movement phase, and in the charge phase, obviously reroll charges and unleash hell. But it wasn't, a lot of times what you're really looking for is turning off, let's say, all out attack, all out defense in the combat phase, or inspiring presence. And so now it's turning everything off. It's like a Horrorghast that doesn't add extra models that flee, and it's turning off things in the combat phase. It got way better, so I would say this is definitely one of the better glow ups of the ones we've got here. All right, Horrorghast. I just mentioned this. Basically the same as what it's always been. It went down 10 points, so about a 15% decrease. Points cost 60 points, 5 plus casting value, range is 12, movement characteristic 8, effect range is 12. Units within 12 inches of this endless spell cannot receive commands in the Battle Shock phase. In addition, if it fails a Battle Shock test within 12 inches, add D3 to the number of models that flee. It's a neutral change, so I'm just going to move on and talk about it at the end. Okay, Lauchon the Soulseeker. Still 50 points, still casting value 6. Range is still 6, movement characteristic is 18, and effect range is wholly within 3 inches. Before the commanding player moves this endless spell, they can pick one friendly wizard with a wounds characteristic of less than or equal to 9, so that shouldn't be MC, that should be WC. Wounds characteristic of less than or equal to 9, wholly within 3 inches of this model. Remove that wizard from the battlefield. After this model has moved, set that wizard up again wholly within 3 inches of this model and more than 9 inches away from all enemy units. After that wizard has been set up, it suffers 1 mortal wound, and then the wizard can make a normal move or run in the following movement phase. They FAQ'd this to be clear that it can't do it unless it's the turn that you actually are supposed to be moving in, which is, of course, what it was always intended to be. But the wording was kind of left that out, so some people thought, well, rules as written, you could definitely move your guy in the enemy's movement phase, which is not a thing it can do. But the big nerf here is it's now restricted to a wounds characteristic of less than or equal to 9. Now, which is a big nerf specifically for the one guy that always took it, which would be Thanquol and Skaven. Keep in mind that the way this kind of worked is it needed to be a wizard, and you wanted to be a wizard that wanted to either be doing movement shenanigans, or could heal, or to heal that one wound it took, or that wanted to be like in combat. And Thanquol, or at least up close with his guns or his melee, wanted to be up close. And this let him kind of get up there, make a normal move like right up to 3 inches, and then do the thing. Or at least within 8 inches so that he could shoot the unit to hell. The problem is, a lot of units, the big guys that are the melee hammer type wizards, like I'm thinking of like Archaon or Be'lakor or something like that, or some of the Soulblight monster casters, their bases can't be set up wholly within 3 inches. Thanquol sits on exactly about as big of a base, and you have to set him up basically right next to the Lauchon model so that it actually works. If you set him up a different way, orientation, he wouldn't count as wholly within 3. And so basically that's the only size base or smaller that actually works with this thing. So he was one of those guys that slipped through the cracks. And now that the wounds characteristic has to be less than or equal to 9, he doesn't get to use it anymore. So it's a sad day for Thanquol. Maybe there's some value in going through and looking at all the other wizards that still could use this, but I think, especially considering it moves at the end, like it moves when all other predatory endless spells move, which is at the end of the hero phase, after you've already cast all your spells. The best thing I think it really would have been nice to do is that it gets to move immediately, and then you'd be within maybe range to cast your second spell. But unfortunately, that's just not what it does. So this one's a little dead in the water. Maybe pun intended. Okay. Malevolent Maelstrom. This one has changed a good bit. Alright. Points cost. Still at 30. Casting value is still 5. Range is 8. Movement characteristic is 8 inches. Its effect range is now X plus 6 inches, which will always be somewhere between 7 to 12 inches, as you'll see in a second. After this end the spell is summoned, place a d6 on a 1 with a value of 1 next to it. Each time a spell is cast and not unbound within 12, increase the number on the d6 by 1 to a max of 6, and you do the same for each model that is slain within 12 inches of this endless spell. At the end of the phase, when it reaches 6, this model is removed from play. When this model is removed from play, add 6 to the value of the dice, and each unit within range of the dice in inches suffers d3 mortal wounds, or 3 if it's wizards. So, let's think about what this means. You cast this thing in your hero phase, and then you can load the thing up. It's already got a 1 by it. You can load it up with other spells, because you could cast it first and then try to load it up. Granted, it hasn't moved yet. And then try to push it up. Now the thing is, if you do cast 5 spells, it's going to go off. It's going to be set up at max, Like, think about that base. Let's say the base is about 1.5 inches. I don't know exactly how big it is, but let's say it's about 1.5 inches wide, or 2 if you want to be kind of conservative. You had to set it up wholly within 8, so that means your wizard's at least within 6 of it. And then, obviously, any of the other wizards that pushed that number up are within it. So you don't want this thing to go off at the end of, your turn. Now, granted, you can move it before you let it go off. Depends on how far you pushed it. So let's say you set it up 8, but -2 because of the base size, because it had to be wholly within, and then it moves 8. So that's 14 inches. So you are safely outside of the 12-inch bubble, probably. Now the question is, are you within 12 inches of the units that you want it to be within? If your army, obviously Daughters and some other armies have abilities to push endless spells. I know the Lord Arcanum on foot in Stormcast can move Predatory endless spells an extra 6 inches, and some people can double the range it's set up. That could be really useful, but of course then you're pushing it outside of your casting bubble, so it could be a trade-off. So maybe in an army like that it's particularly effective, but essentially what happens is, once it hits 6, or once it's removed from being dispelled, which you yourself can also do later. So, for example, the problem is, of course, you dispel endless spells at the start of the hero phase, so it wouldn't be the turn that you cast it. So you'd have to wait till the next one. But you can set this thing off, and it goes off with either the full amount on it, which means it has a 12-inch exploding range, or it has at least a 7, because it always had a 1 on it, plus 6 that's going to get added to it when it's removed from play. So at least a 7-inch range to explode. Which beforehand, the old ways... the old way it went off, you needed to, at best, roll a 4-up. On a 4-up, you would end up triggering the thing going off, and now you can know it'll go off. And if they dispelled it, it didn't go off. So now you know it's going off no matter what. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. But in general, this has a lot of techie potential, I think. Maybe I've explained it in a confusing way, but there are definitely ways to kind of keep yourself out of the detonation range, especially if you're playing against a lot of wizards, which is perfect for this season. All right, let's move on. Okay, Prismatic Palisade. This one went up 10 points, which you might think is kind of crazy. And it might actually be a little crazy, because it's a 33% increase. Casting value went up as well, which you might also think is crazy. Those two things don't seem like they should be moving in the same direction. The range went up by 10 inches, though, and I'm going to explain in a second why this is so important. The effect range is still 6 inches plus 3 extra inches per battle round, a rate that radiates out from it. So, after the setup and at the start of the hero phase, roll a dice for each unit within 6 inches of this model. On the 3-up, that unit cannot shoot in that turn. Add 3 inches to the range of this ability at the start of each battle round after the turn it was summoned. So, max range, if you summoned it turn 1, so 6 plus another 4 turns worth, plus 12. So, we're talking about a max of 18-inch bubble. Now, keep in mind that at casting value 7, someone who doesn't want this to happen is probably going to try to turn it off. So I don't expect you're going to see that maximum range, but yes. Okay, just making sure I wrote this down right. So the points went up, like I said, the casting value went 7, but I wrote a remark that this is good, because if you want it to keep building, a 5 is way easier to dispel than a 7. And most likely you can get a 7 off. If you really need this thing to go off, especially with the primal dice and stuff, it should be fine. Now the setup range, like I said, went up from 8 to 18, so an extra 10-inch range. That's wholly within, but it's kind of a thin base, so it's not that hard to do. It is long. So one of the reasons this is so important is because before, it had a different wording on how it worked. It just automatically turned off shooting for all units within 6 inches of it. But the thing was, how am I going to get my, let's say they had Vanguard Raptors or Sentinels or whatever. How am I going to get this thing up to where I need it to be so they don't get to shoot? Now, of course, you're casting into your own turn, so the only thing you're turning off in your own turn is Unleash Hell. But in the next turn, assuming they can't dispel it, which is, again, good that the casting value is higher, and it could even have a bigger range at that point if you were taking the bottom of the previous turn, and then they take the beginning of the next one, you're turning off their shooting on a 3+. Now, granted, that's only 2/3 chance, 67% chance, but it's still better than, better than nothing, that's for sure. It's not auto, but with the 18-inch setup range, what you're essentially doing is projecting it up into the middle of the field. Now, granted, a lot of the scariest shooters in the game are going to want us just stay at further range anyway. But imagine it's Slaanesh and they need to do the run and shoot stuff, or Namarti Thrall or Reavers, something like that. It's more of a mobile shooting unit. They want to get up close and personal, or the Skaven Eshin stuff. They want to get up close and personal, and you put this in the middle of the field, and especially if it keeps growing, it's going to be able to turn off their stuff. Obviously, you don't necessarily want to bring this with your army if you have shooting, because it might backfire on you. So there's a lot of trade-offs that kind of happened here. Yes, the points went up. Yes, the casting value went up. I do think that's generally good. Setup range is much bigger. It doesn't always trigger. It was a constant debuff before, but it's at the start of the hero phase. You know whether that unit's going to get to shoot or not, which means they can't move outside of the bubble in their own turn to be able to shoot. So I think this is a big buff. Whether people are going to actively be using this, I don't know. But it also has a certain amount of blocking people charging you stuff too. I think the Gravetide's probably better for that. But it is what it is. I think this still has some play. All right. Purple Sun of Shyish. Nothing has changed since the battle scroll changed, except that its points went down 10 points. But I'll just go ahead and read through it. It's 80 points, casting value 8, which is the most expensive casting value of the endless spells. Setup range of 8, movement characteristic 8. Its effect range is 6 for the -1 to save, and 1 inch for the auto kill or extra mortal wounds. And just as before, subtract 1 from save rolls for attacks that target units within 6 inches of the endless spell. In addition, roll a dice for each unit within 1 inch of this endless spell after it is moved. On a 1, if that unit has a wounds characteristic of less than or equal to 9, 1 model from that unit is slain, or otherwise it suffers d6 plus 6 mortal wounds instead. So the average damage is going to be only if one model dies, it's got a wounds characteristic of 1, then the chance it goes off is 1 out of 6, so that's 1/6 of a mortal wound. Up to if it's a big guy, it could be doing 1.58 mortal wounds, I think is the average that I worked out there. Or even if it has a wounds characteristic of 9, then it's a 1 out of 6 chance for 9 wounds. So it's not really doing as much on average mortal wounds as people kind of think it does. It's very swingy. It can do a lot. Obviously max is 12, but or outright killing a hero of 9 wounds, but it's just not really that likely to happen. If they have a lot of independent units that it can get within 1 inch of, then great. But like I said, the points came down, but otherwise no changes since the battle scroll. So I'd say neutral in terms of what's changed. Okay, Quicksilver swords. This hasn't changed at all. So similarly, 60 points, casting value 6+, range is 6, moves 8. Its effect range, I've said it's a move across effect only, meaning it doesn't hit things within 1 inch or moved across or any combination thereof. It's only if it moves across. So after it's moved, you can pick one unit that has any models it passes across and roll 12 dice. For each 5+, it suffers a mortal wound, and those mortal wounds can't be negated. So on average, 4 mortal wounds, and that's great if someone's got a lot of ward saves. Still a great mortal wound spell, and because it doesn't hit your own units, or it doesn't hit units within 1 inch as well as units that it goes across, you're not going to accidentally be hitting yourself as long as you're controlling it, because you're controlling it. You just don't let it go across your unit. Okay, Ravenak's Gnashing Jaws. So 70 points, which is the same as before, same casting value, range. It still moves 3d6 inches and can reroll on the turn that it's set up, and its effect range is 1 inch. So after it's moved, pick one unit that has any models it passed across or that is within 1 inch of at the end of its move and roll a die. On a 2+, so it doesn't go off automatically, if the roll for this endless spell's move was greater than the unit's move characteristic, that unit suffers a number of mortal wounds equal to the difference between that unit's move characteristic and the roll for this endless spell's move, so the difference between the two. Now it's worth pointing out that they did change one thing about this, is that the difference is now rounded down instead of rounded up, which is a very slight deal, right? it's not going to come into play very often unless someone has like a half-inch move because it got halved and it didn't get rounded up or down thin. So it's a very subtle nerf. I wouldn't really make much of a point about that. The max potential damage is 3 to 15 mortal wounds. What do I mean by that? Well, you could obviously roll 3d6 inches for the movement, so 18, and get max get an 18. And the lowest movement characteristic we see in the game is 3s. I'm not assuming you're having someone's movement. So it could be 18 minus 3 is 15, or 18 minus, let's say, or if they have a movement characteristic of, well, I guess if they had a 15, which is about as high as we usually see, it's technically 16, so it could be 2. So I guess maybe max from 3 to 15 is not necessarily 100%. I was thinking maybe on the other end of the spectrum, you roll 3 1s, but then it would, of course, do nothing. So I'd probably change that first 3 there, but the max is definitely 15. The average damage versus a move of 5, which is kind of a standard movement characteristic, is 1.75 to 5.50 mortal wounds. Remember, keeping in mind that that's limited based off of a 2. It needs a 2+, right? So, for example, if you rolled the average on 3d6 is 10.5. Oh no, this wasn't taking into account the 2+. So that's actually assuming you roll the 2+. Just for those at home that want to know, that would be, so the low end of that is 1.46, and then the high end of that is 4.58. So yeah, okay. Anyway, let's move on. Shards of Valagharr. These got changed a bit. Points cost stay the same at 40, casting value 5. Range is holier than 18 for both pieces. Its movement characteristic and coherency for setup is a wholly within 8, which is 4 inches less than what it used to be. So that's a nerf. Its effect range is 6 inches. So when you set these up, they both have to be wholly than 18 of the caster, and then wholly than 8 of each other. That's their coherency. Now, I say that there's a movement characteristic here, and the way it works is every turn you can move one of the 2 pieces so long as the 2 pieces are still within wholly than 8 inches of each other. So they can kind of leapfrog each other or do whatever you want as long as they're wholly than 8. So the way it works is units within 6 inches of this model cannot fly or be removed from the battlefield with an effect that would allow it to be set up again the same turn. In addition, units cannot be set up within 6 inches of the spell. So they can't teleport there or be summoned or be rallied or whatever it might be, healed back. So I mentioned that the coherency got tightened up, which is a nerf. It lost half. It used to have the movement of a unit that was exactly on the line of the 2 closest points between the models, which didn't necessarily, and it was all units that were within that, but that line was always a little finicky, and I think that was the main thing keeping people from using this. It doesn't have their movement anymore, but it did add that they can't be set up nearby. So it no longer requires a line, which means that any units within 6 inches of either of these 2 models is a very large bubble. This is particularly good for like denying models coming back onto a grave site. If you kind of put it on either side of the grave site, that would be particularly good. Or someone's trying to rally some people back, or you're trying to keep them from an important teleport that comes to kind of like do a charge into you. You can force them outside of even further than the 9. There's a lot of use on this, and I actually think this could be seeing some play in some tactical techie kind of lists, but we'll have to see. All right, we're almost there. I think we've got a few left. Soulscream Bridge, man, did this one get nerfed? Not as bad as Cogs, but it definitely did. Points is still 80, casting value 6. Its range has been reduced. It used to be that both pieces could be wholly set up within 24. That got reduced to 18, and only for the one that's further away. The other one has to be set up within 1 inch of the caster. and then its effect range is still wholly within 6 inches. So at the start of the movement phase, the player whose turn is taking place can remove one friendly unit that is wholly within 6 inches of a part of this endless spell, and set up again that unit again wholly within 6 inches of the other part more than 9 inches away from enemy units. A unit cannot be removed and set up again in this way more than once per phase. That unit cannot make a normal move or run in the same phase, and can't issue or receive commands until the start of the player's next hero phase. This is huge. So not only did the range get reduced, now, so like think about what used to happen is a wizard would cast it wholly within 24. You could throw it like wholly within 24 to the left and wholly within 24 to the right, and then have some unit that's nowhere near the wizard be able to use this. Or you could just use it to kind of block charges, which I've often done if I didn't need it to teleport, because it's a big-ass base, a chariot base, and you're setting it up right in front of your units so that they can't land within half inch of your unit. Pretty strong. Well, now that wizard's, it's one piece has got to be within the wizard, and the other piece is now 6 inches less than what it used to be away. So its kind of threat range, if you want to call it that, has been largely reduced. Now, the unit doesn't count as... actually, I want to check that real quick to see if that unit doesn't count as having moved. I'll be right back. So apparently, the way it never said anything before either that the unit didn't count as moving, which is like popular for Iron Drakes because they have a buff. They have double the output if they haven't moved. So that was kind of the move for Iron Drakes. The wording is still the same, so I'm assuming it still works the same, and they just can't move afterwards. So there you go. But it doesn't count as their move, so there's that. But anyway, now they can no longer issue or receive commands, and not only for the turn they did it, but it's until the start of that player's next hero phase. So if you're taking a double turn with this unit, and you jump them, you're not getting to all-out defense them, or Inspiring Presence them if they get some unit comes up and tries to retaliate and attacks them, and they need to take a rough battle shock. You're not all-out attacking them, so you better hope that +1 to hit is already on them, or Mystic Shield is already on them, or whatever you need them to do. That can be big. Obviously, they weren't going to move in that following phase, but... Oh, I just said something about double turn. So obviously, if you take the double turn, that is your next hero phase. So that's fine. It resets then. But if they take a double turn after you, then that's what I was implying there. This is pretty rough, and especially with that setup restriction and that it has to be closer to the wizard. So, oof. Soulsnare Shackles. Now, this was never a popular spell, but I got really familiar with it in training for Worlds because with my Lumineth Techless build, I was running Shackles for at least the last half of the games that I played with it. I think I played around 26 games of that list, including Worlds, and then so I probably played at least 13 or so with Shackles, but I think it was more, actually. But anyway... Shackles, what it used to do is basically turn off all units within 6 inches of any of the 3 models. It turned off running and charging. But let's see what it does now. So points cost is the same. Casting value is the same at 7. A relatively high casting value for these guys. Range of 8. Coherency is wholly within 3 inches of each other. And the effect range is 6, as before. At the start of the movement phase, roll dice for each unit within 6 inches of this endless spell. Subtract the result from that unit's movement characteristic to a minimum of 0 until the end of the phase. In addition, if a unit's movement characteristic is reduced to 0 by this ability, it suffers D3 mortal wounds. It also used to, on a 6, you'd roll at that same time at the start of the movement phase. On a 6 for every unit that's within 6, it did D3 mortal wounds to that unit. So if you think about how it has to be set up, your caster, because of the size of the bases, and because all 3 of the models have to be wholly within 8 inches, one of them is implicitly, and they have to wholly within 3 inches of each other in kind of like a triangle. One of them implicitly has to be within 6 inches of your caster, which means nothing you do unless you can extend the range of this thing is going to stop you from getting hit by the potential mortal wounds that used to happen and the not run and charge that used to happen, or now the reduction to your movement characteristic. Now, fortunately, most casters' movement characteristic is going to be 5 or higher, which means unless you roll a 5+, it's not taking any mortal wounds. That said, it is going to be within 6 inches of the spell, and on average it's 3 to 4 inches off their movement characteristic, which means like we're talking about even on a 6 inch movement characteristic caster, we're talking about down to 2 to 3, right? Movement characteristic, which means you can barely move out of range of this thing for the next time. That's okay. Now, it's no longer hampering you. If you want to be able to make the runs and charges that you wanted to do before, you could always make a normal move. But what it is doing is it's no longer stopping your opponent from charging your flank or the front, and that you're trying to protect your castle, like what it really was used for before. And so the real problem here is that all it's doing is lowering their movement characteristic, which means they were probably, if they were within 6 inches, they were probably close enough to get close enough to you to make a charge anyway, and then they just make a charge. All right. And even though the shackles can be a bit of a screen for your units, it's not a great one because they have to be in a triangle. You can't set them as 3 in a line. Now, if it didn't say wholly within 3 inches of each other, it would be a much bigger bubble and would be a lot better, but unfortunately that's just not how it's worded. So I feel like this guy got heavily nerfed. Now, it's not a popular spell. It never was, so it's not going to be, just because it got heavily nerfed does not mean it's going to make a huge impact on the game, but I do think it got heavily nerfed. There are some things that, like Ravenak's Gnashing Jaws, reducing your movement characteristic. Remember, it's only reducing it for their movement phase, not at the end of the hero phase or until the next whatever, the next turn or your next hero phase. So it doesn't pair with Ravenak's Gnashing Jaws, which I think a lot of people are going to be thinking, oh, that's probably what I should use it for. It's only for the movement phase. So, all right. So, Suffocating Gravetide. So it's still 30 points, casting value 6. Its range is 8 inches, and its movement got a buff. It used to be 8-inch movement and now 12, which is great because it's on a big-ass base. And as much as it might seem like a wholly than 8-inch bubble is pretty big, there are a lot of times when if your caster's got a screen in front of them, you can't fit the Suffocating Gravetide in front of that screen because it's just too far. So keep that in mind. That didn't change, but now that the movement characteristic is 12, it might be able to kind of make up for that. Be cast closer to the caster and then fly over your unit, which of course you don't want it to do, but you know, in the last resort could be a thing. So after this endless spell is moved, for each unit that has any models it passed across, so its effect range is a move across only, like the what was it before? The swords, I believe. Roll a number of dice equal to the number of models in that unit. For each 5, that unit suffers 1 mortal wound. It used to be for each 6. So now it's killing 1/3 of a horde unit's models, assuming that horde unit has a wounds characteristic of 1. So it doubled its output, which is great, and its movement went up by 50%. So this definitely got buffed, and I actually think it's a pretty good screen. Because it's on a big base, and it doesn't hurt your unit as long as it doesn't go across it. So there you go. All right, last and definitely one of the least, Umbral Spellportal. Still a points cost of 80 points, casting value of 5. Range is wholly than 18 as before, but only for the further spell. The closer one has to be within 1. Now, you might say, this is what it all... I mean, like, a lot of times you wanted to cast it next to the caster, right? Sure. But what you used to also be able to do is set up, just like the bridge, which got nerfed in a similar way, you'd set up one portal pretty far away and another one pretty far away so that you had more flexibility with who could cast it. But okay, fine. In the normal use of this, it was 18 and then 1. And so, like, you were probably setting up within 1 anyway. It does mean, of course, that your other caster needs to be close to this caster to be able to use it. The caster that maybe wants to, put some extra damaging spell through it. And its effect range is wholly than 6 for predatory endless spells that are trying to move through it. It's got a lot of text here. I'm just going to summarize. Basically, when a wizard within 1 inch of this endless spell attempts to cast a spell, the range and visibility of that spell can be measured. You have to pick this. Now, we'll go into that in a second. And endless spells can't be summoned through it. In addition, once per turn, if a predatory endless spell starts a move holier than 6, it can end without counting as having moved holier than 6 of the other one. Okay? So let's talk about some implications here of the changes. The closer portal now has to be closer to the caster, and it's unbindable. Whatever spell you push through it is unbindable from the further portal, the one that you push it through. So basically, because everyone's unbinding range is 30 inches, it basically means you no longer can snipe someone from super far away, and then I'm outside of 30 from the caster, because the new portal counts as the caster for unbinding purposes. So now there's always some interplay now. So that's a nerf. And then of course the setup range is a nerf, depending on how you used to play it. Endless spells that move through it are now wholly within instead of within, so that's also a bit of a nerf, especially if the spell is a big one, like Purple Sun. Because keep in mind, because that endless spell it doesn't count as having moved when it goes through, and it doesn't get to move. That means it doesn't get to trigger anything that goes off on movement, but some things that issue just neutral buffs or bubbles, like the Purple Sun, will in fact get to do their thing. And this is a subtle thing, and I kind of referenced this earlier, but the wording now says that you can no longer decide to use the spell after the spell has been successfully cast. So let me read through how it used to work, because I think some people are going to miss this one. All right, Umbral Spellportal. The old wording was once per turn, if a wizard successfully casts a spell within 1 inch of the spell, the range, visibility, and effect of that spell can be measured from one part. Okay? Let's look at the new one. This is the wording of the new one. Once per turn, when a wizard within 1 inch in the spell attempts to cast a spell, the commanding player can say that the spell will be sent through the portal. If they do so, the range, visibility, and effect of that spell can be measured from one part of the spell instead of one, and the part of the spell is considered to be the wizard. Now, the wording difference here, unless there's something subtle I'm missing here, means once per turn, when a wizard within 1 inch of the spell attempts to cast a spell. So at the moment of attempting, so like you say, I'm going to cast a spell, that means you have to say, I don't know whether it's going to be successful or not. I'm going to send it through the portal. Meaning, you can't just see if it's successful and then be like, oh, it didn't work, so I still have something else I can send through the portal. It doesn't work that way. So that got nerfed too. So in total, we've got the setup range stuff. And remember, the points cost and casting value didn't change to make this better, to help balance it out. So the setup range got reduced with the second portal. It's now unbindable from the second portal. The endless spells now have to be wholly within before they do their thing instead of just within. And you can actually lose your opportunity to cast this because you have to declare it before you've actually cast. Big nerf. All right, so we're done with our spells. Let's look at some popular picks. This has changed a good bit since the last time. And I don't know if these are going to be the popular picks, but this is what I am theory crafting right now. So Geminids are denying command abilities until for the rest of that phase. And it's good for all armies. Pretty awesome. Okay? That's a good buff. Maelstrom has a techie kind of mortal wound bomb that's kind of going off, and it's best for magic armies that can kind of guarantee that it's close to going off. Or something that can push it further afield. And keep in mind, if you did push this through Portal, it would be, it doesn't have to count as move to have done its thing. So you push it through Portal and then boom. Lifeswarm. I still think Lifeswarm, this is probably an unpopular pick, a hot take, but I still think healing is always good, and not all armies have access to it, and bringing back your units is really strong, or healing a hero that you really need to keep alive that's got a good save and a good mortal wound kind of ward. I think that's just very high value. Horrorghast, still popular. It's going to help kill off your hordes by turning off their inspiring presence, or turning off killing elites. Like if you do just enough that you force that roll, and then you can kind of push it over the edge, you could be getting some juicy mortal wounds effectively by slaying that last model. But it's probably better against hordes. Burning Head. The new version of Burning Head, which kind of possesses that unit, is creating a timer before the unit dies, or it's forcing your opponent to dispel it. Which I think has some techie, kind of like Maelstrom, some techie use. And then Purple Sun, I still think this is fantastic for that 6-inch bubble of weakening saves and being hard to dispel. And it's really good for shooting armies that want to keep away from it and not also be at risk of having their save reduced. And it's obviously also still really good for ethereal units like Nighthaunt. But if we go on to Nerfed to Hell, I only found 5, and these could be debatable. But Cogs, it's no longer an auto take for magic heavy armies with it not rerolling wounds or rerolling casting rolls, and the extra buff to that is just so weak. Arcane Bolt, Mystic Shield, okay, fine, but I don't think it's an auto take, especially for when we got so many great mortal wound spells. Spellportal, everything I just said about it with the range severely reduced, and it now has counterplay. It's a lot less valuable, and its points didn't go down. Shackles, they, granted, like I said before, they're not really an auto take for anyone. They weren't super popular, but they lost turning off run and charge, which was really what made them so overbearingly worth taking and overwhelmingly kind of feel baddy for the army that can't dispel them. Soulscream Bridge, much less flexible setup now, and then units can't use command abilities, so if you get double turned especially, you're pretty screwed, and if you needed to rely on some command ability to go off after they teleported, you're shit out of luck. And then Lauchon, granted, again, like I said before, wasn't really being used by a whole lot of armies outside of Thanquol. It's still going to let you teleport that wizard around if you need it, maybe with not the best timing, but could be a thing. But Thanquol's out, and so other options are just less appealing. All right, so there we go. Thank you again for following along with this. Hopefully you guys found it interesting. Let me know if I missed anything really big, or if I've, you feel like my hot takes were just not on par here this time. So let me know if I missed something really important here. Obviously, it's the first week of the GHB being out, I guess you could say, with the leaks and stuff. So opinions will change, including my own. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Keep the conversation going in the Discord or in the comments, and let's see if we can get up to 2,000 subscribers in the near future. And in the meantime, guys, Ryan out.